I've never told this story publicly before. Part of me still questions whether I should share it now. Not because I'm afraid people won't believe me. I've made peace with that possibility. But because putting these events into words makes them real again, forces me to acknowledge that what happened wasn't just some vivid nightmare my mind created to protect itself. This happened 3 years ago, when I was working as a seasonal park ranger at Blackwood National Forest. It's a massive stretch of protected wilderness in the Pacific Northwest, known for its ancient pine forests and rugged terrain. The kind of place where self-service disappears the moment you drive past a welcome sign, and the trees grow so dense they block out the sun even at midday. I'd always been drawn to isolated places. Growing up in a crowded suburb outside Seattle, I craved solitude, silence, and a kind of darkness you can only find far from city lights. That's why the ranger position appealed to me. 6 months in a fire lookout tower, miles from the nearest human being, with only the forest and wildlife for company. The lookout tower itself was exactly what you'd expect. A small cabin perched atop a 60-foot steel frame, with windows on all sides offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. Inside was basic but comfortable. A small kitchen area, a desk for logging observations, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with field guides and worn paperbacks left by previous occupants. The bathroom was an outhouse about 50 yards from the base of the tower. Not ideal during thunderstorms or midnight bathroom runs, but I dealt with worse. My job was simple. Watch for smoke, report any signs of fire, monitor weather conditions, and occasionally assist lost hikers who wandered off the marked trails. The first month passed uneventfully. I settled into a comfortable routine. Wake at dawn, check weather instruments, log conditions, scan the horizon for smoke, read, hike nearby trails, repeat. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, I found it therapeutic. It was mid-June when things began to change. I'd been at the lookout for about 5 weeks when I noticed something unusual during my morning scan. About 2 miles northeast of my position, where the forest gave way to a small clearing, I spotted what looked like a tent. This wasn't completely out of the ordinary. Backcountry camping was permitted in certain areas, but this particular spot wasn't on any designated trail. It was strange that someone would camp there, especially since the terrain was rough, and there were much better sites nearby. I made a note in my log, but didn't think much more about it. Probably just an experienced hiker who preferred solitude to the more popular camping areas. I could certainly relate to that. The next morning, the tent was gone. Again, not particularly alarming. Campers move on. But what caught my attention was a thin column of smoke rising from approximately the same location. Using my binoculars, I could see it was a small, controlled campfire, but regulations strictly prohibited open fires in that area due to the dry conditions. I radioed my supervisor, who instructed me to hike out and issue a warning. The hike took about an hour. The forest was unusually quiet that day. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my boots on the pine needle-covered ground and my own breathing. When I reached the clearing, I found the remains of a campfire, still warm, but no sign of any campers. No tent, no gear, not even footprints apart from my own. Just a perfectly circular arrangement of stones surrounding the ashes, and something that made my skin crawl. A crude figure fashioned from twigs and pine needles, propped against a tree at the edge of the clearing. It resembled a human form, about 1 foot tall, with disproportionately long limbs and a head tilted at an unnatural angle. I've seen plenty of stick figures made by bored hikers or playful children, but this was different. There was something deliberate about its construction, something that felt wrong. I took a photo, dismantled the fire ring, and headed back to the tower, trying to convince myself it was just some hiker's idea of a joke. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up, causing the tower to creak and sway slightly. Around 2 a.m., I was startled awake by what sounded like footsteps on the metal stairs leading up to the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps, pausing between each one as if whoever or whatever was climbing didn't want to be heard. I lay perfectly still, listening. The steps continued, growing closer until they reached a small landing outside my door. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Finally, I gathered enough courage to grab my flashlight and knife from the bedside table. With shaking hands, I approached the door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. After several minutes of internal debate, I unlocked the door and yanked it open, ready to confront whatever waited on the other side. The landing was empty. The stairs were empty. There was nothing but the vast darkness of the forest below and the star-filled sky above. I swept my flashlight beam across the surrounding area, half expecting to see someone or something retreating into the trees. But there was only stillness. I convinced myself it had been a dream, or perhaps an animal climbing the tower out of curiosity. Mountain lions were known to explore strange structures in their territory. That had to be it. I closed the door, double-checked the lock, and returned to bed, though sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. The following day passed without incident. I mentioned a campfire in my daily report, but left out the stick figure and the nighttime disturbance. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. Maybe if I'd reported everything from the beginning, what happened next could have been prevented. 3 days later, I spotted another column of smoke, this time from a different location, about 3 miles northwest of the tower. Again, I radioed in and hiked out to investigate. What I found was identical to the first site, a carefully constructed fire ring with warm ashes, no sign of campers, and another twig figure propped against a tree. This one was larger, almost 2 feet tall, and more intricately constructed. Its head was adorned with what appeared to be animal teeth, and small pieces of dark fabric were woven into its limbs. I took more photos, documented the location, and returned to the tower. This time, I included everything in my report, both fire sites, the figures, and the strange noises at night, which had continued intermittently. My supervisor seemed concerned but not alarmed. He suggested it might be locals playing pranks or possibly environmental activists trying to make some obscure point about forest management. He promised to send someone to investigate, but mentioned it might take a few days due to staffing shortages. That night, the footsteps returned. Only this time, they didn't stop at the door. I heard a slow, deliberate scratching along the outside wall of the cabin, circling completely around before returning to the door. Then came a soft tapping, 3 distinct knocks, followed by silence. I sat up in bed, knife in hand, heart pounding so loudly I was certain whatever was outside could hear it. The tapping came again, 3 knocks, slightly louder this time. I remained frozen, unable to approach the door as I had the previous night. Then came a voice, or something approximating a voice. It was barely above a whisper, with a strange, hollow quality that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Ranger," it said, drawing out each syllable. "I see you." I'd like to say I responded bravely, that I threw open the door and confronted the source of the voice. But the truth is, I was paralyzed with fear. I sat there, clutching my knife, until dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows. Only then did I approach the door. There was no one there, of course, but scratched into the wooden door, at about eye level, was a crude symbol, a circle with a vertical line bisecting it. Below it, arranged in a neat row, were 3 pine cones, each containing a single black feather. I photographed everything, then spent the next hour trying to reach my supervisor on the radio. The signal was unusually weak, filled with static. When I finally got through, I demanded immediate evacuation. I couldn't explain why, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was in danger. My supervisor was skeptical, but agreed to send someone to check on me the following morning. He advised me to remain in the tower, keep the door locked, and maintain regular radio contact. I agreed, though the thought of spending another night in the tower filled me with dread. As dusk approached, I prepared for what I was certain would be another visit. I positioned my chair to face the door, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. Hours passed. The forest grew dark. An unusual fog rolled in, so thick I could barely see the trees at the base of the tower. Then I heard it, not footsteps this time, but a soft, rhythmic humming coming from the forest below. It was joined by another voice, then another, until what sounded like a dozen voices were humming in perfect unison. The melody was unlike anything I had ever heard, discordant yet strangely harmonious, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to follow no logical progression. I switched off my lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness, and moved to the window, facing the direction of the sound. At first, I could see nothing through the dense fog. Then, as if responding to my presence at the window, the fog began to thin, revealing what appeared to be figures moving among the trees. They were tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to glide rather than walk, leaving no disturbance in the underbrush. I counted 7 distinct shapes, arranged in a loose semicircle around the base of the tower. They remained partially obscured by the fog and darkness, but I could make out enough to know they weren't human, at least not entirely. Their proportions were wrong, limbs too long, torsos too narrow, and heads too small for their frames. As I watched, frozen in horror, one of the figures tilted its head back and looked directly up at my window. I couldn't make out facial features, but I felt its gaze lock with mine, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever these things were, they had been watching me for far longer than I had been watching them. The humming stopped abruptly. The figure raised what appeared to be an arm, pointing directly at me. The others turned in unison, all looking up at my window. Then, as if responding to some unheard command, they began to move toward the tower. I scrambled away from the window, heart racing. The radio! I needed to call for help. I grabbed the handset, frantically adjusting the frequency, but received nothing but static. Through the static, almost imperceptibly, I could hear what sounded like the same humming, now interspersed with words I couldn't understand. A loud metallic clang from below told me they had reached the base of the tower. Then came the sound I had been dreading, footsteps on the metal stairs. Not one set, but many, climbing slowly, deliberately, in perfect synchronization. I had seconds to decide what to do. The tower had no other exit besides the door. The windows were too small to climb through, and even if they weren't, a 60-foot drop awaited on the other side. I was trapped. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear them on the landing now. The door handle began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing force when it met the resistance of the lock. I backed away, knife raised, though I knew it would offer little protection against whatever waited on the other side. The pressure on the handle stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the scratching again, this time more frantic, covering the entire surface of the door. It was joined by a sound that still haunts my nightmares, a high-pitched, keening wail that seemed to contain both rage and hunger in equal measure. The door began to shake in its frame as something, or several somethings, threw their weight against it. The old wood creaked and splintered. It wouldn't hold for long. In desperation, I grabbed my emergency flare gun from the supply cabinet. It was meant for signaling in case of fire or medical emergency, but at that moment, it was the closest thing I had to a weapon. I loaded a flare, aimed at the door, and waited. With a final, powerful impact, the door burst open. The darkness beyond seemed absolute, deeper than mere absence of light. I caught a glimpse of something tall and thin, with too many joints and angles that bent in impossible ways. Then I fired. The flare illuminated the landing in harsh red light, revealing nothing. The space was empty. The stairs were empty. There was no sign of the figures I had seen in the forest, no evidence of the force that had broken my door. But the humming continued, now seeming to come from inside the cabin itself, from the very air around me. And written on the inside of the broken door, in what looked horribly like fresh blood, was a message. We are always watching. I don't remember much of what happened next. According to the official report, I fired several more flares into the forest before barricading myself in the cabin. A Forest Service helicopter spotted the flares and diverted to investigate. They found me the next morning, severely dehydrated and in a state of extreme distress. The official explanation was that I had suffered a psychological break due to prolonged isolation, not uncommon among fire lookouts. They pointed to the broken door, which they claimed showed signs of being damaged from the inside, not the outside. The message I had seen was dismissed as a hallucination. No unusual figures were spotted in the forest, and no evidence of unauthorized campfires was found at the locations I had documented. My photos of the stick figures and the symbol on the door were explained away as hoaxes I had created myself, perhaps unconsciously, to alleviate the monotony of my isolation. The scratches on the door were attributed to a bear or mountain lion curious about the strange structure in their territory. I was quietly dismissed from my position and encouraged to seek psychiatric help. For a while, I almost believed their explanations. I almost convinced myself that what I had experienced was nothing more than an elaborate delusion brought on by solitude and stress. Then, 3 weeks after I returned to Seattle, I received a small package in the mail. No return address, no note inside, just a small wooden box containing 3 items: a black feather, a pine cone, and a crude figure made of twigs, identical to the ones I had found in the forest. I moved the next day. I changed my name, my phone number, my email, everything that could be used to trace me. I've been careful since then, always looking over my shoulder, never staying in one place too long. Because I know the truth, even if no one else does. They're still out there, watching from the shadows between the trees, waiting. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I can still hear that strange, rhythmic humming just at the edge of perception. I don't expect you to believe me. Most people don't. But if you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness and the forest falls unnaturally silent and you feel eyes on you from directions where no eyes should be, don't ignore it. Don't tell yourself it's just your imagination. And whatever you do, don't look up into the trees. Because once they know you've seen them, they'll never stop watching. I've always considered myself a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters or things that go bump in the night. Or at least I didn't. Not until last winter, when something happened that I still can't explain. Something that shattered my comfortable understanding of reality and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. I work as a long-haul truck driver, mainly covering routes through the Midwest and parts of the South. It's not the most glamorous job, but pays well enough, and I've always enjoyed the solitude of the open road. There's something peaceful about driving through the night, with nothing but your thoughts and the endless ribbon of highways stretching out before you. The incident occurred during a routine run from Chicago to Memphis. It was mid-January, and a massive cold front had swept down from Canada, bringing with it temperatures well below freezing and the threat of snow. The forecast had mentioned the possibility of flurries, but nothing serious enough to delay my trip. I'd driven in much worse conditions and wasn't particularly concerned. I left Chicago around noon, planning to drive straight through and arrive in Memphis by early morning. The first few hours were uneventful. Clear skies, light traffic, the usual monotony of Interstate 57 heading south. As the evening approached, I stopped at a truck stop just outside Effingham, Illinois, for a quick meal and a top off my fuel tank. That's where I first noticed him, a thin, elderly man sitting alone at the counter of the diner. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him at first glance. Gray hair, weathered face, clothes that had seen better days. But something about the way he watched me as I entered caught my attention. His gaze was too intense, too focused, like he had been waiting specifically for me to walk through that door. I did my best to ignore him, taking a booth as far from the counter as possible and focusing on my coffee and the plate of mediocre meatloaf the waitress brought me. But I could feel his eyes on me throughout the meal, and when I glanced up, he was always looking in my direction, his expression unreadable. As I was paying my bill, he approached my table. Up close, there was something unsettling about his appearance that I hadn't noticed from across the room. His skin had an almost waxy quality to it, and his eyes were a pale, milky blue that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "You're heading south," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, uncomfortable with the interaction, but not wanting to be rude. "Memphis." He shook his head slowly. "Not tonight. A storm's coming. Worse than they're saying on the news." "The weather report just mentioned some light snow," I replied, already edging toward the door. The old man's expression didn't change. "There are different kinds of storms," he said cryptically. "Some bring snow. Others bring things much worse." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, which he placed on the table between us. It was a tarnished silver coin, unusual in design, with symbols I didn't recognize etched into its surface. "Keep this with you," he said. And whatever happens, don't stop driving. Not for anything or anyone. Not until you see the sunrise. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing through a door marked "Employees Only." Though he clearly didn't work there, I stood frozen momentarily, staring at the coin on the table. Part of me wanted to leave it there, to walk away from this strange encounter and forget it had ever happened. But something, curiosity perhaps, or some deeper instinct I couldn't name, made me pick up the coin and slip it into my pocket. Back on the road, I tried to dismiss the old man's warning as the ramblings of someone not entirely in touch with reality. But as the miles passed and darkness fell, his words replayed in my mind. The weather remained clear, though the temperature continued to drop, and I began to relax. It was just another strange encounter on the road, nothing more. Around 10 p.m., I crossed the state line into Kentucky. The traffic had thinned considerably, with only the occasional car or truck passing in either direction. I was making good time, and the earlier unease from my encounter with the old man had mostly faded. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, a fog began to roll in. It started as thin wisps to the edges of my headlights, but rapidly thickened until visibility was reduced to less than 100 feet. I slowed my speed accordingly, leaning forward in my seat as if those few extra inches would help me see through the dense white wall ahead. The fog was unusual, unnaturally dense and localized. I could see stars overhead through gaps in the mist, which meant it wasn't a widespread weather phenomenon. It seemed explicitly concentrated on the stretch of highway I was traveling, almost as if it had been waiting for me. That thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. I reached for the radio, hoping some music would distract me from the increasingly uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. But instead of the classic rock station I'd been listening to earlier, I was met with static harsh, grating noise that seemed to fluctuate in intensity, almost like it was forming patterns just beyond my comprehension. I tried other stations with the same result. Even the CB radio, which I used to communicate with other truckers, produced nothing but that same strange static. I was effectively cut off from the outside world. The rational part of my brain suggested a simple explanation. I was passing through an area with poor reception. This happens all the time on long hauls. But combined with the unnatural fog and the old man's warning, it was becoming increasingly difficult to cling to rational explanations. I checked my GPS, which showed I was approaching a small town called Meridian Hollow. I'd never heard of it, which wasn't unusual. My routes took me through dozens of small, forgettable towns. According to the GPS, there was a truck stop just off the next exit, where I could wait out the fog if necessary. As I neared the exit, the fog suddenly parted, revealing a green highway sign that read Meridian Hollow 1 mile. But there was something wrong with the sign. Despite the freezing temperature, the letters seemed to shift and waver as if viewed through heat distortion. And for just a moment, so briefly I almost convinced myself I'd imagine it, the sign appeared to read something entirely different, in characters that resembled no language I'd ever seen. I blinked, and the sign was normal again. Just an ordinary highway marker, slightly weathered but otherwise unremarkable. I chalked it up to fatigue and the poor visibility, but my unease continued to grow. The exit ramp loomed ahead, and I signaled to turn off the interstate. As I did, my hand brushed against the coin in my pocket, and the old man's words echoed in my mind. Don't stop driving. Not for anything or anyone. Not until you see the sunrise. I hesitated, my turn signal still blinking, the exit yards away. Something about this didn't feel right. The fog, the static, and the strange sign all set off alarm bells in my mind. I swerved back onto the highway at the last moment, continuing south. As soon as I passed the exit, the fog thickened dramatically, reducing visibility to almost zero. I slowed to a crawl, straining to see the road ahead. The truck's headlights seemed to penetrate only a few feet into the dense white wall surrounding me. Then, through the fog, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I instinctively slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the cold asphalt. As the vehicle shuddered to a halt, the figure became clearer, a woman in a pale dress, her long dark hair obscuring her face. She stood perfectly still, directly in my path, seemingly unaffected by the freezing temperature despite her thin clothing. My first thought was that she must be in trouble. Perhaps her car had broken down and she was trying to flag down help. I reached for the door handle, then froze as the old man's warning again echoed. Don't stop driving. Not for anything or anyone. I remained in the cab, engine idling, uncertain what to do. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't even reacted to the massive truck that had nearly run her down. She just stood there, face downcast, hair moving slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel inside the cab. "Hey!" I called out, rolling down my window a few inches. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response. No movement. Just that eerie stillness. I reached for my phone, thinking to call for assistance, but the screen showed no signal. Of course. I was about to try the CB radio again when the woman finally moved. Slowly, almost mechanically, she raised her head. Her hair parted, revealing her face, or what should have been her face. Where features should have been eyes, nose, mouth, there was only smooth, blank skin like an unfinished mannequin. Yet somehow, impossibly, I could feel her looking at me, studying me with senses I couldn't comprehend. A sound escaped her, not from a mouth that didn't exist, but seemingly from the air around her. It was similar to the static on the radio, but modulated, almost like speech, but in no language I recognized. It made my skin crawl and my stomach churn. Then she began to move toward the truck. Her movements were wrong, jerky and disjointed, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Each step seemed to cover more distance than should have been physically possible, bringing her rapidly closer to my door. Panic surged through me. I threw the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, not caring if I hit her. At that moment, escape was all that mattered. The truck lurched forward, engine roaring. I braced for impact, but there was none. In my side mirror, I could see the woman standing in the middle of the road, watching my departure. Then the fog swallowed her, and she was gone. My hands shook so badly that I could barely keep the wheel steady. What I had just seen was impossible. People don't have blank faces. They don't move like broken dolls or speak in static. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination brought on by fatigue and poor visibility, but the image of that featureless face was burned into my mind. I pushed the truck as fast as I dared in the dense fog. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to find somewhere to stop, to wait until morning when visibility would improve. But the old man's warning and the encounter with a faceless woman had shaken me to my core. Something told me that stopping would be a fatal mistake. For what felt like hours, I continued south through the impenetrable fog. The GPS showed I was still on I-57, but the landmarks indicated exits, rest areas, towns never materialized. It was as if I were driving through some parallel version of the highway, recognizable in its basic form but fundamentally altered in its details. The static on the radio continued, occasionally shifting into patterns that almost sounded like words. Distant, distorted voices trying to communicate something urgent. I switched it off, preferring silence to those almost messages that seemed to scratch at the edges of my sanity. According to the dashboard clock, the fog began to thin slightly around 2 a.m. Through breaks in the mist, I could make out the surrounding landscape. Rolling hills covered in dense forest, much closer to the highway than I remember from previous trips along this route. The trees themselves seemed wrong somehow. Too tall, too straight, their branches reaching toward the road like grasping fingers. And there were lights among the trees, small, flickering points of pale blue illumination that moved in ways no natural light source should. They seemed to follow the truck, keeping pace just within the tree line, always visible in my peripheral vision, but disappearing when I tried to look at them directly. The coin in my pocket had grown inexplicably warm, almost hot against my thigh through the fabric of my jeans. I reached down and touched it to the material, and immediately the lights in the forest retreated, as if repelled by whatever power the small silver disc possessed. The fog continued to thin, and I began to make better time. The GPS still showed no recognizable landmarks, but at least I could see the road clearly now. My relief was short-lived, however, as I rounded a bend and saw something that made me question my sanity once again. Ahead, the highway was blocked by what appeared to be a small town, built directly across all lanes of the interstate, not next to the road, not accessible by an exit, but literally constructed on top of the highway itself, as if the interstate had been built first and then the town had materialized around and over it. I slowed the truck, staring in disbelief at the impossible scene before me. The buildings were old Victorian in style, with steep roofs and narrow windows that reflected no light despite the illumination from my headlights. Signs hung from storefronts, their letters in that same unrecognizable script I thought I glimpsed on a highway sign earlier. People, or things that resembled people from a distance, moved through the streets of this impossible town. Their proportions were slightly wrong, limbs too long or too short, movements too fluid or too jerky to be entirely human. None of them looked toward the truck, despite the headlights illuminating their strange procession. I came to a complete stop about 100 yards from the edge of town. There was no way around it. The forest pressed close to the highway on both sides, the trees too densely packed to drive between. The only options were to go through the town or turn back. As I sat there, engine idling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, movement in my side mirror caught my attention. Looking back, I saw the fog I had left behind was advancing rapidly, rolling toward the truck like a living thing with purpose and intent. Within it, I could make out shapes, tall, thin figures moving with that same wrong fluidity I'd observed in the town ahead. I was trapped between two impossibilities, the town that couldn't exist and the fog filled with entities I couldn't comprehend. The coin in my pocket now felt like it was burning to the fabric, and I pulled it out, wincing at its unexpected heat. In the dim light of the cab, I could see the symbols on its surface more clearly. They seemed to shift and change as I watched, rearranging themselves into patterns that somehow conveyed meaning despite being in no language I recognized. And that meaning was clear, forward. The only way out was through. I took a deep breath, returned the coin to my pocket despite its heat, and pressed down on the accelerator. The truck moved forward, toward the impossible town that straddled the highway. As I approached the outskirts, the figures on the street stopped their strange processions and turned as one to face the oncoming truck. Their features were indistinct at first, but as I drew closer, I could see that they all shared the same blank, featureless faces as the woman I'd encountered earlier on the road. They made no move to get out of the way as I drove toward them, maintaining their positions directly in my path. I hesitated, foot hovering over the brake. Despite their otherworldly nature, the thought of deliberately running down what appeared to be people was abhorrent. Then they began to change. It started with the ones closest to the truck. Their forms seemed to ripple and distort, limbs elongating, torsos twisting in ways that defied anatomy. Their blank faces split open, revealing not mouths but circular openings lined with what looked like hundreds of needle-like teeth. From these openings came that same static speech I'd heard before, now amplified 100-fold. A cacophony of alien sounds that made my ears ring and my vision blur. Self-preservation took over. I floored the accelerator, aiming the massive truck directly at the transformed figures. They made no attempt to avoid the impact, and I felt a series of thuds as the vehicle plowed through them. But instead of the resistance I would expect from hitting solid bodies, it felt more like driving through dense smoke, a momentary pressure that quickly dissipated. In my mirrors, I could see the figures were forming behind me, their bodies reconstituting from the mist-like substance they had become upon impact. They began to pursue the truck, moving with impossible speed, their elongated limbs covering ground in great, loping strides. I drove to the heart of the impossible town, past buildings that seemed to lean inward as I passed, their windows revealing brief glimpses of scenes that couldn't possibly exist within their confines. Vast, cavernous spaces, strange machinery, rituals performed by more of those blank-faced entities around pulsing columns of light. The road beneath my wheels no longer felt like asphalt, but something softer, almost organic, that seemed to shift and pulse with each passing mile. The engine of the truck strained, as if the air itself had become thicker, more resistant to movement. The pursuing entities were gaining on me, their static speech growing louder, more insistent. The coin in my pocket now felt like a live coal against my skin, and the air in the cab had taken on a strange metallic taste that made it difficult to breathe. Just as the first of pursuing figures reached the back of the truck, I saw it. The end of the town, the highway continuing beyond into blessed normality. I pushed the struggling engine to its limits, ignoring the warning lights flashing on the dashboard. As the truck crossed the threshold between the impossible town and the regular highway beyond, there was a sensation like passing through an invisible membrane, a moment of resistance followed by a sudden release. The engine's roar returned to normal, the air became breathable again, and the coin in my pocket cooled instantly. In my mirrors, I could see the town receding, the pursuing figure stopping exactly at its boundary, unable or unwilling to cross into the normal world. They stood there, watching the truck depart, their blank faces somehow conveying a hunger and frustration that transcended the need for conventional expressions. Then, between one blink and the next, both the town and its inhabitants were gone, replaced by the empty highway and dense forest I would expect to see on this stretch of road. If not for the lingering static on the radio and the coin in my pocket, I might have convinced myself it had all been a vivid hallucination. I drove on through the remainder of the night, refusing to stop despite my exhaustion and the lingering fear that what I had experienced might somehow find a way to follow me. The old man's warning remained at the forefront of my mind. Don't stop driving, not until you see the sunrise. As the eastern sky began to lighten, I found myself approaching the outskirts of Memphis. The familiar skyline in the distance was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen, a confirmation that I had returned to the world I knew and understood. The sun crested the horizon just as I pulled into the delivery depot, its warm golden light seeming to cleanse away the lingering shadows of the night's experiences. Only then did I allow myself to stop to breathe, to try to process what had happened. I completed my delivery on autopilot, going through the motions while my mind continued to grapple with the impossible things I had witnessed. When asked about my delayed arrival, I mumbled something about fog and poor road conditions, unable to articulate the truth even if I had wanted to. Before leaving Memphis, I tried to research Meridian Hollow, the town mentioned on the exit sign, before everything went sideways. According to every map and database I could access, no such place existed anywhere along my route. The stretch of I-57 where I had experienced those impossible events showed nothing but uninterrupted highway passing through national forest land. I considered getting rid of the coin, throwing away or burying it somewhere it would never be found. But something stopped me, an instinct that told me it had protected me during that strange journey, and might need to do so again. Because here's the thing, I still drive that route. My job demands it. And while I've never again encountered the dense, unnatural fog or the impossible town, I sometimes catch glimpses of things at the edge of my headlights. Tall, thin figures standing perfectly still among the trees. Lights that move in ways no natural phenomenon should. And occasionally, just at the threshold of hearing, that same static speech coming to my radio in the darkest hours of the night. I keep the coin with me always now. I don't know what it is or where it came from, but I believe it marks me somehow, not as prey, but as something recognized and, for reasons I may never understand, temporarily spared. The old man who gave it to me has never reappeared, though I look for him every time I stop at that same truck stop in Effingham. Sometimes I wonder if he was ever really there at all, or if he was something else wearing the appearance of humanity, just as those entities in the fog wore their approximation of human form. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it. But if you find yourself driving alone at night, particularly through the less traveled parts of this country, and you notice the fog growing unusually thick or hear strange static on your radio, don't stop. Keep driving, no matter what you see or hear, and pray for the sunrise. Because I've come to believe there are places where the boundaries between our world and somewhere else grow thin. Places where things that should not exist can slip through, if only for a few hours in the darkest part of the night. And once they've noticed you, they don't forget, they don't give up, they're patient, and they're always watching. There's a house at the end of Blackwood Lane that no one talks about. It's been there for as long as anyone can remember. A Victorian monstrosity with peeling paint and sagging shutters, set back from the road behind an overgrown garden and a wrought iron fence that's more rust than metal. Growing up in the small town of Millfield, we all knew the stories. The house was haunted, cursed, built on an ancient burial ground. All the usual tales that circulate among children looking for thrills. As teenagers, it became a rite of passage to spend a night on the property, though few made it past the garden gate before losing their nerve. I was different. I never participated in those midnight dares. Not because I was afraid, but because something about the house fascinated me in a way I couldn't articulate. While other kids saw a spooky old building perfect for ghost stories, I saw something else. Something that called to me in a language I didn't yet understand, but somehow recognized on a level deeper than conscious thought. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm a historical preservationist specializing in 19th century architecture, a career choice that I now realize was probably influenced by my childhood obsession with the house on Blackwood Lane. I hadn't thought about the place in years, having left Millfield right after high school for college, and then a job with a prestigious firm in Boston. Then, 3 months ago, my mother called to tell me she'd been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. The prognosis was good, but she would need surgery and radiation therapy. Without hesitation, I took a leave of absence from my job and returned to Millfield to care for her during her treatment. Being back in my hometown was strange. Everything was simultaneously familiar and foreign, like a dream of a place I'd once known. The main street had been revitalized with boutique shops and artisanal cafes, but the essence of the small town remained unchanged. The same families, the same gossip, the same unspoken rules that governed social interaction. I settled into a routine of driving my mother to appointments, managing her medications, and handling household chores she was too exhausted to tackle. It was during one of these drives, taking a shortcut home from the hospital, that I found myself on Blackwood Lane for the first time in over a decade. I hadn't planned to go that way. In fact, I'd actively avoided the street since returning to Millfield, but a traffic accident had closed the main road, and the GPS rerouted me without warning. By the time I realized where I was, it was too late to turn around. "Oh, look," my mother said, her voice thin but alert. "The old Blackwood house. Remember how obsessed you were with that place as a child?" I nodded, trying to keep my eyes on the road ahead, rather than on the looming structure now visible through the trees. "I remember. They're finally selling it, you know," she continued, "after all these years. There was an article in the local paper last week. That caught my attention. Selling it? Who owns it? Some trust or foundation, I believe. The last actual resident died in the 1970s, long before you were born. It's been tied up in legal issues ever since." She paused, studying my face with a perceptiveness that had always made lying to her impossible. "You still have that look when you talk about it. The same one you had as a little girl." "What look?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "Like it's calling to you." She reached over and patted my hand. "Maybe you should go see it properly while you're in town. Put those ghosts to rest." I laughed, a forced sound that didn't convince either of us. "There are no ghosts, Mom. Just an old house that probably needs to be condemned." But even as I said it, I felt that familiar pull, a sensation like a hook behind my navel, drawing me toward the house with gentle but insistent pressure. I accelerated slightly, eager to put distance between myself and whatever strange influence the place still held over me. That night, after getting my mother settled in bed, I found myself researching the Blackwood house online. There wasn't much information available, just the basic history I already knew. Built in 1887 by a wealthy industrialist named Thaddeus Blackwood, who lived there with his wife Constance and their 3 children. Thaddeus died under mysterious circumstances in 1902, and the family left town shortly after. The house changed hands several times over the next few decades before being purchased by an elderly widow named Margaret Crane in 1963. She lived there alone until her death in 1976, after which the house remained unoccupied. What the brief history didn't mention were the rumors that had circulated among Millfield residents for generations. Stories of strange lights seen through the windows on moonless nights, of voices heard from empty rooms, of people who entered the house and came out changed in subtle but profound ways. I was about to close my laptop when a new email notification appeared. The sender was unfamiliar, t.blackwood@meridianholdings.com. The subject line read simply, "The house on Blackwood Lane." My finger hovered over the delete button, assuming it was spam with an eerily coincidental subject. But curiosity won out and I opened the message. "Ms. Hayes, it has come to our attention that you have returned to Millfield and may have an interest in the property at 1887 Blackwood Lane. As representatives of the Blackwood Family Trust, we are reaching out to qualified individuals with expertise in historical preservation who might be interested in evaluating the property before it goes on the market. Given your professional background and personal connection to Millfield, we believe you would be an ideal candidate for this task. The evaluation will require a thorough inspection of the property, including the main house and several outbuildings. Compensation would be substantial. If this opportunity interests you, please reply to this email, and we will provide further details. Regards, Theodore Blackwood, Meridian Holdings." I stare at the screen, a chill running down my spine despite the warm summer night. How did they know I was in Millfield? How did they know about my personal connection to the house? And most importantly, how had they got my email address? The rational part of my brain suggested simple explanations. Small towns had no secrets. Someone had seen me drive past a house and mention it to someone connected to this Blackwood Trust. My email was publicly available through my firm's website. There was nothing supernatural about it, yet something about the timing felt too perfect, too orchestrated. As if the house itself had somehow reached out, using this Theodore Blackwood as its instrument. I closed the laptop without replying, determined to ignore the strange invitation. But sleep eluded me that night. My dreams filled with images of the house, not as it appeared now, decrepit and abandoned, but as it must have looked in its prime. Gleaming woodwork, polished brass fixtures, stained glass windows casting colorful patterns across hardwood floors. And throughout these dreams, a sense of expectation, as if the house was waiting for something, for someone, for me. I woke before dawn, my decision already made though I hadn't consciously arrived at it. I would visit the house, not as a response to a mysterious email, but on my own terms. I would confront whatever strange hold this place had over me and finally break its spell. My mother was still asleep when I left, leaving a note explaining I had some errands to run. The morning was misty, the sun not yet high enough to burn away the fog that clung to the fields and forests surrounding Millfield. The drive to Blackwood Lane took less than 15 minutes, the roads nearly empty at this early hour. As I approached the house, I was struck by how much larger it seemed up close. From the road, it was impressive but not overwhelming. A 3-story Victorian with a typical ornate trim and multiple gables of that architectural period. But as I parked my car and approached the rustic gate, I realized the house extended far back from what was visible from the street, with additional wings and outbuildings partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. The gate wasn't locked, or rather, the lock was so corroded it broke apart when I touched it. The hinges protested with a sound like a distant scream as I pushed the gate open just enough to slip through. The front garden, once meticulously landscaped judging by the remnants of stone pathways and the occasional glimpse of a statue among the weeds, was now a tangled wilderness. Yet there was something almost deliberate about the overgrowth, as if the plants had arranged themselves to create a specific path to the front door. I followed this natural corridor, noting with professional interest the architectural details of the house that became visible as I drew closer. Despite years of neglect, the craftsmanship was evident. Intricate woodwork on the wraparound porch, leaded glass in the windows that had somehow survived decades of abandonment, stone foundations that showed no signs of settling or cracking. The front steps creaked under my weight, the wood soft in places but still structurally sound. The porch itself was in better condition than I would have expected, as it protected from the elements by some unseen force. And the front door, a massive oak slab with an ornate brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, looked almost new, its varnish still glossy despite the peeling paint on the surrounding trim. I hesitated before touching the knocker, suddenly aware of the absurdity of my situation. I was about to knock on the door of an abandoned house, as if expecting someone to answer, yet it felt like the proper thing to do, a necessary formality before entering. The knocker was cold against my palm, much colder than it should have been on a summer morning. I lifted it and let it fall, the sound echoing not just through the house, but seemingly through the ground beneath my feet, a resonance that felt more physical than auditory. I waited, though, for what I couldn't say. When no response came, as of course none would, I tried the doorknob. It turned easily, the mechanism smooth and well-oiled. The door swung inward without a sound, revealing a foyer that defied all expectations. Based on the exterior condition of the house, I had anticipated dust, cobwebs, perhaps evidence of animal intrusion or water damage. What I found instead was a space that, while clearly uninhabited, showed none of the expected signs of long-term abandonment. The hardwood floor gleamed with a soft patina. The wallpaper, though faded, remained intact. A massive staircase curved upward to the second floor, its banister polished to a soft glow. Most surprising of all was the quality of light. Despite the early hour and the mist outside, the foyer was filled with a warm, golden illumination that seemed to emanate from the very walls rather than from any visible source. It created an atmosphere of welcome, of homecoming, that was as unsettling as it was seductive. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vastness of the house. "Is anyone here?" No response came, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, evaluated. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. Professional curiosity overcame my unease, and I began to explore. The foyer opened onto a grand parlor to the right and a formal dining room to the left, both furnished with pieces that would have been fashionable in the late 19th century. A piano stood in one corner of the parlor, its ivory keys yellow with age but free of dust. In the dining room, a table large enough to seat 20 was set with fine china and crystal, as if in preparation for a dinner party that never occurred. Beyond these rooms lay others, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a conservatory filled with plants that should have died decades ago, yet appeared vibrant and healthy, a kitchen with equipment both antique and surprisingly modern. Each space was immaculately preserved, existing in a strange limbo between past and present. As I moved deeper into the house, I began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere. The golden light that filled the foyer gradually shifted to a cooler, bluer tone. The air became noticeably cooler, carrying scents that seemed out of place. Sea salt, despite being miles from the ocean. Smoke, though no fireplaces showed signs of recent use. And beneath it all, a sweet floral fragrance I couldn't identify. Time seemed to behave strangely within the house. What felt like minutes of exploration would reveal themselves as hours when I checked my watch. Rooms that should have connected logically based on the exterior dimensions of the house instead led to unexpected spaces, creating a floor plan that defied conventional geometry. I found myself in a narrow corridor I was certain I hadn't seen before, lined with doors on both sides. Each door was identical, dark with a simple brass knob, except for symbols carved into their surfaces. Not numbers or letters, but intricate patterns that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. One door in particular drew my attention. The symbol carved into its surface resembled a spiral, though it seemed to contain more dimensions than should have been possible in a two-dimensional carving. As I studied it, I felt a familiar sensation, that same pull I'd experienced whenever I thought about the house, but stronger now, almost irresistible. Without conscious decision, I reached for the doorknob. It turned easily under my hand, and the door swung open to reveal not another room, but what appeared to be an entirely different house. Through the doorway, I could see a sun-drenched kitchen with modern appliances and bright yellow walls. Nothing like the somber Victorian aesthetic of the Blackwood house. A woman stood at the counter with her back to me, humming softly as she chopped vegetables. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, exposing the nape of her neck, where a small birthmark was visible, a crescent shape that matched exactly the one I'd had since birth. With a sense of detachment, as if watching someone else's actions, I saw my hand reach out toward the woman. Just before my fingers would have touched her shoulder, she began to turn. I slammed the door shut before I could see her face, though in my heart I already knew who I would have seen. The corridor seemed to contract around me. The other doors suddenly much closer than they had been moments before, their symbols writhing like living things against the wood. I ran, no longer concerned with mapping the house or understanding its secrets. All I wanted was to find my way back to the entrance, back to the normal world where houses obeyed the laws of physics and doors didn't open onto impossible scenes. Corridors twisted. Staircases appeared where none had been before. Rooms rearranged themselves as if the house was deliberately trying to confuse me. Yet somehow, I eventually found myself back in the main foyer, the front door visible across the polished floor. I was halfway to the exit when a voice stopped me. Not a physical sound, but words that formed directly in my mind with perfect clarity. "You've only just arrived, Eleanor. Why such haste to depart?" I turned slowly, expecting to find someone behind me. The foyer was empty, yet the sense of presence was overwhelming. "Who are you?" I asked aloud, feeling foolish but unable to respond in any other way. "You know who I am." The voice in my mind was neither male nor female, old nor young. It simply was as fundamental as gravity or time. "Just as I know you. We have been waiting for each other for a very long time." "I don't understand." My voice echoed in the empty foyer, small and frightened. "The house remembers, Eleanor. It remembers everyone who has ever lived within its walls, everyone who will ever live within them. Past, present, future. These are human constructs, limitations of perception. The house exists beyond such constraints." A chill ran through me as I processed the implications. "Are you saying the house is alive?" Something like amusement colored the response in my mind. "Not alive as you understand the term, but conscious, yes, aware, and very, very patient." "What do you want from me?" I asked, backing slowly toward the door. "Nothing you are not already seeking yourself. You have always been drawn to this place. Eleanor Hayes, did you never wonder why?" Before I could respond, the quality of light in the foyer changed, darkening to a deep amber reminiscent of late afternoon, though it was still early morning outside. The air grew thick, almost syrupy, making each movement an effort. "Look," the voice commanded, and suddenly the walls of the foyer were no longer solid but transparent, like windows into other times. I saw the house as it had been when first built, pristine and new. I saw Thaddeus Blackwood in his study, poring over books whose titles I could almost but not quite read. I saw his wife Constance in the garden, her face turned away as she clipped roses with silver shears. The images shifted, showing the house in different eras, occupied by different families. In each scene, there was a constant, a woman with her back turned, always just out of clear view, always with that same crescent birthmark visible on the nape of her neck. "You have been here before, Eleanor," the voice said, "many times in many lives, and you have always left before your work was complete." "What work?" I whispered, unable to look away from the shifting scenes. "The work you were born to do, the preservation not just of this house, but of what it contains, what it protects." The transparent walls now showed the house as it currently existed in the physical world, deteriorating, abandoned. But beneath the visible structure, I could perceive something else. A network of glowing lines, like veins of light running through the foundations, walls, and roof. They converge at the center of the house, in a room I hadn't discovered during my exploration, forming a pulsing nexus of energy. "What is that?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer. "A threshold," the voice replied. "A doorway between worlds that must be maintained, protected. That has been the purpose of this house, since its creation, and the responsibility of the Blackwood line. Your line, though you know it by a different name now." The implications were too vast, too disturbing to fully comprehend. Yet they resonated with something deep within me, a knowledge I had carried without realizing it. "If what you're saying is true," I said slowly, "why don't I remember? Why doesn't anyone remember? Memory is a burden few can bear across lifetimes. It is easier to forget, to start anew with each incarnation. But the house remembers, Eleanor. The house always remembers." The transparent walls returned to solid form, the visions fading. The oppressive quality of the air lightened, allowing me to move more freely. I found myself no longer backing toward the door, but standing in the center of the foyer, facing the grand staircase. What happens if I say no? I ask, if I walk out that door and never return? Then the cycle continues. The house will wait. Another will come, perhaps in this generation, perhaps in the next. The threshold will weaken but hold, as it has before. And you will live out this life never knowing what you were meant to be, always feeling that something essential is missing. I thought of my life in Boston, successful by conventional standards but never quite fulfilling. The relationships that inevitably faltered, the persistent sense of searching for something I couldn't name. Had that been the house's influence all along, drawing me back to this moment? And if I say yes, then you take your rightful place. You learn what those before you knew. You maintain the threshold, and in doing so, you protect far more than just this house. It wasn't really a choice. Perhaps it never had been, from the moment I first saw the house as a child. Some paths are determined long before we become conscious of walking them. What do I need to do? I asked. The voice in my mind seemed to smile. For now, simply return to your mother. Care for her as you planned. When the time is right, you will receive instructions regarding the sale of the house. Ensure that you are the one who purchases it, regardless of competing offers. And then you will come home, Eleanor Blackwood. Truly home at last. With those words, the presence in my mind receded, leaving behind a silence that felt both empty and expectant. I stood in the foyer for several minutes, processing everything I had experienced, everything I had learned. When I finally left the house, the sun was high in the sky, the morning mist long since burned away. According to my watch, I had been inside for nearly 5 hours, though it had felt like less than one. My phone showed several missed calls from my mother, concerned about my unexplained absence. As I walked down the overgrown path toward the gate, I glanced back at the house. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure in one of the upper windows, a woman with her hair pulled back, watching me depart. Then the image was gone, if it had ever been there at all. I don't know what awaits me in the house on Blackwood Lane. I don't know what the threshold is or what lies beyond it. But I know that I will return, that I must return, not because of some supernatural compulsion, but because for the first time in my life, I understand my purpose. The house has been waiting for me, and now I am waiting for it. 3 months have passed since that day. My mother's treatment was successful, and she's recovering well. I resigned from my position in Boston, citing personal reasons. The Blackwood house was listed for sale last week, and despite several higher offers, my bid was mysteriously accepted. Tomorrow I move in. Sometimes at night, I wake to find myself standing at my bedroom window, staring out at nothing. Sometimes I catch glimpses of figures at the edge of my vision, tall, thin shapes that vanish when I turn to look directly at them. And sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear that strange, rhythmic humming. I don't know what waits for me in that house. I don't know what lies beyond the threshold I'm meant to guard. But I know this. Once I cross that threshold, I may never return as the person I am now. This will be my final recording. If you're watching this, it means I've already gone back to the house on Blackwood Lane, back to where I belong. Listen carefully now. If you ever find yourself drawn to an abandoned house that seems to call your name, if you ever feel watched by eyes you cannot see, if you ever hear that strange humming in the darkest hours of the night, run while you still can. What do you think is waiting for Eleanor in the Blackwood house? What secrets lie beyond that threshold? Share your theories in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss my next upload. And if you really enjoyed it, sharing helps the channel grow so more people can experience these tales of the unexplained. Until next time, sleep well if you can.